In the year 2387, humanity had made contact with over 200 alien species across the galaxy. We had learned their languages, traded with their civilizations, and even adopted some of their customs. But there was one universal truth that every species seemed to share. Some beings were considered untouchable, cursed, or simply too dangerous to approach. What humanity was about to discover was that sometimes the most feared creatures in the universe aren't the ones with the sharpest claws or the deadliest venom. Sometimes they're the ones carrying the greatest gift, a gift so powerful that entire civilizations would rather live in ignorance than face the terrifying responsibility that comes with it. Dr. Sarah Chun thought she was just volunteering an intergalactic animal shelter. She had no idea she was about to make a choice that would reshape the balance of power across 1,000 worlds, challenge the oldest laws of the Galactic Council, and prove once again why humanity's greatest strength has always been our stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind. The alien cat in cage 847 had been waiting 3 years for someone brave enough to see past the warnings. Today, that wait would finally end. Dr. Sarah Chun pulled her volunteer jacket tighter as she walked through the sprawling corridors of Station Haven, the galaxy's largest interspecies animal rehabilitation center. The artificial gravity hummed beneath her feet, and the air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the atmospheric needs of creatures from hundreds of different worlds. After 6 months of volunteering here, she still found herself amazed by the sheer diversity of life that passed through these halls. Today felt different, though. The usual chatter among the alien staff members seemed muted, and she noticed several of the Zenthri workers crossing their forearms in what she had learned was their equivalent of making a protective ward. Even Crix, the normally cheerful mollusk supervisor, had barely acknowledged her greeting with more than a nervous bubble of acknowledgement. "Sarah, you are punctual as always," came a voice behind her. She turned to see Dr. Vexhai, the station's chief veterinarian. The tall, crystalline being's usual light blue glow seemed dimmer than normal, and his typically precise movements carried an edge of uncertainty. "Is everything all right, Doctor?" Sarah asked, noting the way his photosynthetic patches flickered with what she had come to recognize as anxiety. "Everyone seems on edge today." Vexhai's crystalline features shifted in what might have been a grimace. "We have a situation, a difficult case that has been with us for quite some time. I was hoping, given your species' unique perspective on challenging situations, that you might be willing to assist." Sarah raised an eyebrow. In her 6 months here, she had helped rehabilitate creatures that other species considered impossible cases. There was the 3-headed siren of Tau Ceti that had been driven mad by isolation, the poisonous flowers from Kepler 442b that had been slowly dying from loneliness, and even a shadow cat from the Veil Nebula that existed partially in another dimension. Humans, it turned out, had a reputation for succeeding where others gave up. "What kind of situation?" she asked. Vexhai gestured for her to follow him deeper into the station, past the regular rehabilitation wings, and into a section she had never seen before. The corridors here were darker, and she noticed additional security measures, energy barriers, warning signs in dozens of languages, and biometric scanners every few meters. 3 years ago, Vexhai began as they walked. "We received a transfer from the Sanctuary Worlds. The creature in question is what humans might recognize as feline in appearance, though she originates from a planet called Nexus Prime in the Andromeda Spiral." They passed a viewing window, and Sarah glimpsed what looked like a containment area filled with soft, shifting lights. Inside, barely visible in the gentle glow, was indeed a cat-like creature. She was roughly the size of a large house cat, with fur that seemed to absorb and reflect light in impossible ways, creating an effect like looking at the night sky filled with slow-moving stars. Her eyes were large and luminous, a deep violet that seemed to hold depths of intelligence that made Sarah's breath catch. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered. "She's also untouchable," Vexhai said grimly. "Her species, the Nexari, are what your people might call psychic, but their abilities go far beyond simple telepathy. They can form what we call soul bonds with other sentient beings. Once bonded, the connection is permanent and transformative. Sarah studied the creature more closely. Despite the obvious care that had been taken with her environment, there was something heartbreakingly lonely about the way she sat in the center of the space, her star-filled tail wrapped around her feet. Transformative? How? Sarah asked. Vexai's glow dimmed further. The bond grants both beings enhanced cognitive abilities, emotional stability, and, in some cases, extended lifespan. It sounds beneficial, but the Galactic Council has classified Nexury bonding as a Class 7 prohibited interaction. Why? Because once bonded, both beings become something more than they were before. The Council fears that such transformations could upset the balance of power between species. Moreover, the bond cannot be broken except by death. Many species view this as a form of enslavement, despite evidence that the relationship is entirely consensual and mutually beneficial. Sarah watched as the Nexury lifted her head and seemed to look directly at her through the viewing window. Those violet eyes held such intelligence, such loneliness, that Sarah felt her heart clench. What happened to her? How did she end up here? Her previous bonded companion was a researcher named Zintar from the Helix Nebula. They worked together for 47 years, studying quantum consciousness across multiple dimensions. When Zintar died of natural causes, she was brought here because no one else would take her. Most species won't even risk being in the same room with a Nexury. But she's mourning, Sarah said, recognizing the signs she had seen in so many creatures who had lost their companions. She needs connection, not isolation. Indeed, but the law is clear. Interaction with Nexury is forbidden without explicit council permission, and such permission has not been granted in over 3 centuries. Sarah continued to watch the creature, noting the way her ears drooped and how she barely moved from her central position. What's her name? The Zintar called her Aurelii, though I believe that is simply their word for starlight. Her true name, if she has one, is unknown to us. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching Lyralii. The creature's fur continued its slow celestial dance, but Sarah noticed that the patterns seemed to be growing dimmer, less vibrant. She's dying, isn't she? Sarah asked quietly. Vexai's confirmation came as a barely perceptible dimming of his own light. Nexury are social beings. Without connection, without purpose, they simply fade. We estimate she has perhaps 6 months remaining, possibly less. And no one has tried to help her. Many species have expressed sympathy, but none are willing to risk council sanctions. The penalties for unauthorized contact with a Nexury include exile from council space and permanent marking as empathically compromised. Sarah felt a familiar surge of the stubbornness that had gotten her through medical school, through her residency in xenobiology, and through every impossible case she had ever taken on. What would happen if someone did make contact? Hypothetically speaking, Vexai turned his full attention to her, his crystalline structure practically humming with concern. Sarah, you cannot be considering. I'm not considering anything yet. I'm just asking what would happen. The doctor was quiet for a long moment, his internal light shifting through several colors Sarah had never seen before. Hypothetically, he said finally, if contact were made and a bond formed, both beings would be immediately classified as council fugitives. They would be exiled from all council space and forced to live in the outer rim territories where council law does not extend. And if no bond formed, that is unlikely. Nexury only bond with beings they consider suitable companions. They are highly selective, but humans... He paused. Humans have certain traits that Nexury find compatible. Your emotional range, your capacity for growth, your stubborn loyalty to those you care about. Sarah looked back at Lyralii, who had moved closer to the viewing window. The creature's eyes met hers again, and Sarah felt something pass between them. Not telepathic communication exactly, but a recognition. A understanding. She knows I'm here, Sarah said. Nexury are empathically sensitive. She can likely sense your emotional state, your intentions. It is part of how they evaluate potential bonds. Has she shown interest in anyone else who's visited? You are the first visitor she has had, Vexhai admitted. Most species refuse to even walk past her containment area. Sarah felt her heart break a little more. 3 years of complete isolation, slowly dying from loneliness, while bureaucrats and politicians debated the theoretical dangers of connection and growth. I need to think about this, she said finally. Sarah, Vexhai said gently, I must advise you that even considering this course of action could have serious consequences. Your species has worked hard to establish good relations with the Council. If you were to— I said I need to think about it, Sarah interrupted, though not unkindly. I'm not making any decisions right now. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Looking at Lyralii, really looking at her, Sarah saw not a dangerous alien to be avoided, but a grieving, intelligent being who needed help. And if there was one thing Sarah had never been able to do, it was walk away from someone who needed help. As she turned to leave, she noticed that Lyralii had moved to the very edge of her enclosure closest to where Sarah had been standing. The creature's fur patterns had brightened slightly, and for the first time since Sarah had seen her, Lyralii's tail was moving. Just a slight twitch at the tip, but movement nonetheless. I'll be back tomorrow, Sarah said quietly, not sure if she was speaking to Vexhai or to the creature on the other side of the barrier. As they walked back through the security checkpoints, Vexhai was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. Sarah, there's something else you should know. What? The Council has issued a termination order. If Lyralii's condition continues to deteriorate, she will be put to rest in 1 week's time. They cite humanitarian concerns, but I believe they simply wish to avoid the complications her presence creates. Sarah stopped walking. They're going to kill her because it's politically convenient? The official reasoning is that prolonged suffering of a sentient being is unethical. But, yes, I believe the primary motivation is to resolve an uncomfortable situation. Sarah felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest. She had seen this before, beings discarded because they were inconvenient, different, or posed challenges to established systems. It was one of the reasons she had left her position at the prestigious Terra Medical Institute to volunteer in places like this. 1 week, she said. Yes. And if someone were to, hypothetically, make contact with her before then, the termination order would be suspended pending council review of the new situation. Sarah looked back toward the restricted section, thinking of violet eyes and starlight fur and 3 years of profound loneliness. I'll see you tomorrow, Doctor, she said. As she made her way back to the main corridors of Station Haven, Sarah's mind was already working through the implications of what she was considering. She thought about her life on Earth, her career, her family. She thought about the comfortable future she had planned for herself. Then, she thought about Lyralii, sitting alone in her beautiful prison, slowly fading away while the galaxy argued about whether she was too dangerous to touch. By the time Sarah reached her quarters, she had made her decision. She just needed to figure out how to implement it without getting everyone else in trouble. The next morning would change everything, but for now, she sat down at her communication terminal and began researching everything she could find about Nexri bonds, council law, and the legal status of the Outer Rim territories. If she was going to be exiled from civilized space, she wanted to make sure she understood exactly what that meant. But more importantly, she wanted to make sure that when she looked into Lyralii's eyes tomorrow, she would be ready to give the answer that those eyes deserved. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lyralii's violet gaze and felt the weight of the decision before her. She had spent hours researching, reading everything she could find about Nexri bonds, the history of council law regarding psychic species, and, most importantly, the accounts of those few beings who had been bonded before the prohibition was enacted. What she found was far different from the dire warnings she had expected. Instead of tales of enslavement or loss of identity, she discovered records of scientific breakthroughs, artistic collaborations that had shaped entire cultural movements, and partnerships that had literally changed the course of galactic history. The Nexri bonded teams had been responsible for developing faster-than-light communication, breakthrough medical treatments, and even the theoretical framework that led to the artificial gravity systems now used throughout Council space. The prohibition, she realized, hadn't been enacted because Nexury bonds were dangerous to individuals. It had been enacted because they were dangerous to the existing power structure. A bonded pair could think and create and discover at levels that made traditional governments and institutions nervous. Sarah understood that nervousness now. She also understood that she didn't care. When she arrived at Station Haven the next morning, she found Vexai waiting for her near the main entrance. His crystalline structure was flickering rapidly with what she had learned to recognize as extreme agitation. "Sarah, I must speak with you urgently," he said without preamble. "Of course. What's wrong?" "I received a communication from the council last night. They have moved up their timeline. Lyralii is to be terminated today." Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. "Today? But you said we had a week." "There has been political pressure. Several species have filed formal complaints about her continued presence here. They claim her psychic emanations are causing distress among other creatures in the facility." "That's ridiculous. You told me yesterday that her containment prevents any psychic contact." "It does. But fear rarely requires factual basis." Vexai's light dimmed to a barely perceptible glow. "The termination team will arrive in 4 hours." Sarah looked toward the restricted section, her heart racing. For hours. She had known this moment was coming, had spent all night preparing for it, but she had expected more time to plan, to think through all the consequences. "Vexai," she said carefully, "if someone were to interrupt this termination, how would that work legally?" "Sada, no. You cannot." "How would it work?" she repeated firmly. The crystalline being was silent for several moments, his internal light cycling through colors she had never seen before. Finally, he spoke in barely more than a whisper. "If a bond were formed before the termination could be carried out, council law would require a review period of no less than 30 days. Both beings would be confined pending the outcome of that review, but they could not be separated or harmed during that time. And after the 30 days? The most likely outcome would be exile to the Outer Rim, as I mentioned yesterday. But there is a small possibility." He hesitated. "What possibility?" "There are certain provisions in ancient council law, provisions that predate the current prohibition. If a bonded pair could demonstrate exceptional value to galactic civilization, their status might be reconsidered." Sarah felt something like hope stir in her chest. "What kind of value?" "Scientific discovery, artistic achievement, solving problems that have stymied conventional approaches." The last time these provisions were invoked was nearly 4 centuries ago, but the precedent exists. So there's a chance that forming a bond wouldn't necessarily mean permanent exile. A very small chance, yes. But, Sarah, you must understand the risks. Even if the ancient provisions could be invoked, you would both be under constant scrutiny, constant pressure to prove your worth. And if you failed to demonstrate sufficient value, he couldn't finish the sentence. "Then, we'd be exiled anyway," Sarah completed. "Or worse." "Yes." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, her resolve had crystallized into something unshakable. "I need to see her," she said. "Sarah now, before the termination team arrives. I need to see her." Vexai studied her with those multifaceted crystal eyes, and Sarah could see her reflection fractured into dozens of determined faces staring back at her. "Very well," he said finally, "but I cannot officially sanction what you are considering. If you choose to proceed, you do so without the knowledge or consent of Station Haven administration. Understand, and I cannot guarantee your safety. Nexury bonds are permanent and irreversible. Once begun, there is no going back." "I understand that, too." They made their way through the familiar corridors, past the usual morning bustle of the rehabilitation center. Sarah noticed that word of the impending termination had spread. There were fewer staff members in the restricted section, and those they did encounter seemed to go out of their way to avoid eye contact. When they reached Lyralii's containment area, Sarah saw immediately that something had changed. The creature was no longer sitting in her usual spot in the center of the enclosure. Instead, She was pressed against the viewing window, her large violet eyes fixed on the corridor, as if she had been waiting. "She knows," Sarah whispered. "Nexari are highly empathic," Vex High confirmed. "She can sense the emotional state of everyone in the facility. She knows what is coming." Sarah approached the viewing window and placed her palm against the transparent barrier. Lyralii immediately moved to mirror the gesture from the other side, pressing her paw against the barrier directly opposite Sarah's hand. The moment their positions aligned, Sarah felt something she couldn't quite describe. Not quite telepathic communication, but a sense of understanding, of connection that went deeper than words. She could feel Lyralii's loneliness, her fear, but also something else. Hope, trust. "She's choosing me," Sarah said in wonder. "Even knowing what it means, she's choosing to trust me. The feeling is mutual, I suspect," Vex High observed quietly. Sarah looked at the control panel beside the viewing window. The containment field could be disabled from here, but doing so would trigger immediate security alerts. The moment she touched that panel, there would be no going back. "Vex High," she said without taking her eyes off Lyralii, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for any of this. You've given me all the information I need to make an informed decision. Whatever happens next is my choice, not yours. Sarah, and I want you to know that this isn't a rash decision. I've spent all night thinking about this, researching it, understanding what it means. I'm not doing this on impulse." "Then, why are you doing it?" Sarah finally turned to look at the crystalline doctor, and he could see in her eyes the same stubborn determination that had made humanity respected and sometimes feared throughout the galaxy. "Because 3 years ago, someone I never met made a choice to trust a member of my species enough to form a bond that lasted 47 years. That bond produced work that still benefits billions of beings across the galaxy. When that person died, their partner was discarded like broken equipment instead of being honored as the contributor she is." She looked back at Lyralii, who was still maintaining her position at the barrier. "Because in 4 hours, a beautiful, intelligent being is going to be killed for the crime of being inconvenient to politicians who have never even met her." She moved toward the control panel. "And because if humans have learned anything in our short time in this galaxy, it's that sometimes doing the right thing means ignoring the people who insist that the right thing is impossible." Her hand hovered over the containment release. "Sarah," Vex High said urgently, "once you do this, both of your lives will change forever. Are you certain this is what you want?" Sarah looked one more time at Lyralii, at those ancient, intelligent eyes that held such hope and trust. She thought about her comfortable life, her career prospects, the safety and security she was about to give up. Then she thought about living with the knowledge that she had let fear and politics kill someone she could have saved. "I'm certain," she said, and pressed the release. The containment field dissolved with a soft harmonic chime. For a moment, neither Sarah nor Lyralii moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, Lyralii stepped forward through the space where the barrier had been. The moment Lyralii touched the corridor floor outside her enclosure, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Emergency lights flashed, and Sarah could hear the sound of security teams mobilizing. But all of that seemed distant and unimportant compared to what was happening right in front of her. Lyralii approached slowly, cautiously, as if she couldn't quite believe this was really happening. When she reached Sarah, she sat back on her haunches and looked up with those remarkable violet eyes. "Hello," Sarah said softly. "I'm Sarah." What happened next was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. It wasn't telepathic speech exactly, but somehow she understood Lyralii's response as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. "I know who you are," came the sense of communication, tinged with wonder and gratitude. "You are the one who chooses to see past fear. You are the one who values connection over safety. You are the one I have been waiting for. Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. "Once we bond, there's no going back. We'll both be exiles." "I've been in exile for 3 years already," Lyralii responded. "But with you, exile could become adventure. Sarah knelt down so that she and Lyralii were at eye level. Then yes, if you'll have me, I choose to bond with you. Lyralii's purr was like distant stellar music, and her fur began to shine brighter, the star patterns moving faster and more vibrantly than Sarah had seen them before. And I choose you, Sarah Chin of Earth. Let us become more than we are apart. The bond formed gradually, like dawn breaking over a planet's horizon. Sarah felt her consciousness expanding, touching Lyralii's and finding not absorption or loss of identity, but enhancement. Her thoughts became clearer, her understanding deeper. She could feel Lyralii's memories, 47 years of partnership with Zentar, discoveries that had shaped the understanding of reality itself, the grief of loss, and now the overwhelming joy of connection renewed. At the same time, she felt Lyralii experiencing her own memories, her childhood on Earth, her years of study, the determination to help beings that others had given up on. She felt the Nexary's amazement at the depth of human empathy, the stubborn refusal to abandon hope even in impossible situations. They were still themselves, but they were also something more, something that could think thoughts neither could have conceived alone, feel emotions that were deeper and richer than either had experienced in isolation. The security teams arrived just as the bond finished forming, but they stopped short when they saw the two beings sitting peacefully in the corridor, surrounded by the soft glow of Lyralii's enhanced fur patterns. "Stand down," came Vexai's voice over the communication system. "The situation is under control." "Doctor," came the response from the security team leader. "The creature has escaped containment." The creature has a name," Sarah said, standing up with Lyralii beside her. "Her name is Lyralii, and she is no longer contained because she is no longer a prisoner." The security team leader, a large, armored being from Rigel 7, looked uncertainly between Sarah and the small, star-furred cat at her side. "Ma'am, council regulations," interrupted a new voice, "are about to become very complicated." Everyone turned to see Vexai approaching, his crystalline structure now glowing with what Sarah recognized as fierce determination. "Dr. Vexai," the security leader said, Your orders just changed," Vexai announced. "As of this moment, Dr. Sarah Chun and Lyralii are under the protection of the ancient bonding provisions, Section 127 Alpha of the original Council Charter. Any attempt to separate or harm them before the mandatory review period has concluded would constitute a violation of the oldest laws in Council space." The security leader looked confused. "Sir, I've never heard of... That is because these provisions have not been invoked in nearly 4 centuries, Vexai said. "But they remain valid Council law, and they supersede all newer regulations regarding psychic species." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the crystalline doctor, enhanced by her bond with Lyralii into something that made her eyes water with its intensity. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Vexai said, "we wait for the council to remember that some laws are older and more important than their fear. And we hope that you too can prove that some bonds are worth preserving, no matter how inconvenient they might be." As if summoned by his words, Sarah's communication device chimed with an incoming priority message from Earth. The message was brief, but significant. "Dr. Chun, please respond immediately. We have received an official inquiry from the Galactic Council regarding your status." "What is your situation?" Sarah looked at Lyralii, who looked back with those wise violet eyes. Through their new bond, she felt the Nexary's calm confidence, her absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "My situation," Sarah said aloud as she prepared to respond to Earth, "is about to get very interesting." The council hearing chamber on Station Prime was the largest enclosed space Sarah had ever seen. Delegates from over 200 species occupied the tiered seating that surrounded the central platform where she and Lyralii now stood, waiting for the proceedings to begin. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of ancient laws and older prejudices. 2 weeks had passed since the bond was formed. 2 weeks of confinement, interrogation, and preparation for this moment. Through it all, Sarah had found that having Lyraliai's presence in her mind made even the most stressful situations manageable. The Nexary's calm wisdom balanced Sarah's natural impatience, while Sarah's human determination seemed to rekindle something in Lyraliai that had been dormant since Zentar's death. They had spent their confinement period productively, much to the surprise of their guards. Sarah's medical knowledge, combined with Lyraliai's understanding of quantum consciousness, had already led to 3 theoretical breakthroughs in treating traumatic memory disorders. Their preliminary notes had been transmitted to research facilities across the galaxy, generating excitement among scientists even as politicians debated whether the bonded pair should be allowed to continue existing. "All rise for the High Arbiter," announced a voice that seemed to come from the very walls of the chamber. The assembled delegates rose as a figure descended from the apex of the chamber, an ancient being whose species Sarah didn't recognize. They appear to be made of living starlight contained within a roughly humanoid form, and when they spoke, their voice carried harmonics that made Sarah's bones vibrate. "This hearing is convened to determine the status of the human Sarah Chun and the Nexary designated Lyraliai, who have formed an unauthorized psychic bond in violation of Council Resolution 847 Delta," the High Arbiter intoned. "The defendants invoke the ancient bonding provisions of Section 127 Alpha. Let all present bear witness that this hearing will be conducted according to the most sacred laws of our Union." Sarah felt Lyraliai's encouragement flow through their bond, steadying her nerves. They had prepared for this, studying the ancient laws that Vexhai had helped them research. The provisions were clear. A bonded pair could not be separated or punished if they could demonstrate exceptional value to galactic civilization within a 30-day period. "The prosecution will present their case," the High Arbiter announced. A tall, severe-looking being from Altair Prime stepped forward. Counselor Threshka was known throughout the galaxy as one of the most conservative voices in the Council, and her opposition to psychic bonding was well documented. "Honored Arbiter," she began, her voice carrying the authority of centuries of political experience. "The human and the Nexary stand accused of violating one of our most fundamental laws, a law enacted to protect the sovereignty of all species from psychic manipulation and unwanted mental intrusion." Sarah felt a spike of anger, but Lyraliai's calming influence helped her maintain her composure. "The prohibition against Nexary bonding was not enacted lightly," Threshka continued. "Our ancestors witnessed the dangers of unchecked psychic development. Entire civilizations have been dominated by beings with enhanced mental capabilities. The bonding process creates entities that exist outside normal social and legal frameworks, answerable to no authority but their own expanded consciousness." Murmurs of agreement rippled through sections of the assembly. Sarah noticed that the delegates from the older, more established species seemed particularly receptive to Threshka's arguments. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, "The human Sarah Chun showed reckless disregard for the safety of others when she chose to release a confined Nexary without proper authorization. Her actions endangered everyone on Station Haven and violated dozens of safety protocols." Threshka gestured toward a holographic display that showed footage from the security cameras during Sarah's decision to open Lyraliai's containment. "We see here a clear example of the dangerous impulsivity that characterizes the human species. This individual chose personal sentiment over galactic law, endangering countless lives for the sake of her own emotional satisfaction." The display changed to show statistical data about previous Nexary bonds and their outcomes. "The defense will claim that Nexary bonds have historically produced beneficial results," Threshka said, "but they ignore the fundamental question of autonomy. How can we be certain that the achievements attributed to bonded pairs are not simply the result of psychic coercion? How can we trust decisions made by beings whose very thoughts have been altered by alien influence?" Sarah felt Lyraliai's amusement at the irony of that accusation and had to suppress a smile. The ancient provisions cited by the defense were written in a different era, when our understanding of psychic manipulation was primitive, Threshka concluded. Today, we know better. Today, we understand that the preservation of individual mental autonomy is more important than any potential scientific advancement. I urge this council to uphold our current laws and order the immediate dissolution of this illegal bond. The chamber fell silent as Threshka returned to her seat. Sarah felt the weight of the assembled gazes upon her, and Lyralii, and, for a moment, the magnitude of what they were facing threatened to overwhelm her. Then, she felt Lyralii's mental touch, warm and reassuring. They fear what they do not understand, the Nexari communicated privately. But you have always specialized in helping others overcome their fear. The defense may present their case, the High Arbiter announced. Sarah stepped forward, feeling more confident than she had any right to feel in a chamber filled with beings who held her fate in their hands. Honored Arbiter, fellow delegates, she began. 2 weeks ago, I made a choice that many of you consider reckless and illegal. I chose to form a bond with a being who was scheduled to be executed for the crime of being inconvenient. She gestured to Lyralii, who moved to stand beside her. The Nexari's fur was glowing softly with patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Sarah's heartbeat. The prosecutor speaks of autonomy and mental sovereignty as if they are absolutes, Sarah continued. But every meaningful relationship involves some level of mutual influence. When I bonded with Lyralii, I did not lose my humanity, I discovered more of it. She activated her own holographic display, showing the research they had completed during their confinement. In 2 weeks of collaboration, we have developed new treatments for 3 previously incurable psychological disorders. We have identified 17 novel applications for quantum consciousness theory. We have created artistic works that have already been requested by museums on 47 different worlds. The display showed brain scans, mathematical formulas, and artistic compositions that demonstrated the enhanced cognitive abilities resulting from their bond. But, more importantly, Sarah said, we have proven that the connection between our species can bridge differences that others consider insurmountable. Lyralii's partner, Zentar, spent 47 years in a similar bond, producing work that still benefits billions of beings throughout the galaxy. When Zentar died, instead of honoring that legacy, the Council chose to treat Lyralii as a dangerous artifact to be contained. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she warmed to her theme. The prosecutor asks how we can be certain that our achievements are not the result of coercion. I ask in return, how can we be certain that any achievement is free from influence? Every scientist builds on the work of those before them. Every artist is shaped by their cultural context. Every individual is influenced by their relationships and experiences. She paused, looking around the chamber at the assembled delegates. The difference is that Lyralii and I choose our influence consciously. We enter our bond willingly, with full understanding of what it means. We accept the responsibility of enhanced capability because we believe that connection and understanding are more valuable than isolation and fear. Murmurs began to spread through the chamber again, but this time Sarah sensed that they were not entirely hostile. The ancient provisions cited in our defense were not written by primitive peoples who didn't understand psychic manipulation, Sarah continued. They were written by beings wise enough to recognize that true progress comes from embracing beneficial change, not from hiding from it. She activated a new section of her display, showing historical records of bonded pairs and their contributions to galactic civilization. Every major breakthrough in interspecies communication, every advancement in consciousness studies, every solution to problems that seemed impossible, they all came from beings who were willing to transcend the limitations of their individual perspectives. Sarah felt Lyralii's pride and encouragement flowing through their bond, giving her the strength to make her final argument. You can dissolve our bond, she said, but you cannot dissolve what we have already accomplished together. You can exile us, but You cannot exile the knowledge we have created. You can silence us, but you cannot silence the questions we have raised about the price of safety versus the value of growth. She looked directly at the High Arbiter. Honored Arbiter, I stand before you not as a human who has been diminished by psychic manipulation, but as a being who has been enhanced by conscious choice. Lyralii stands beside me not as a dangerous alien to be feared, but as a partner who has helped me become more than I ever could have been alone. We ask not for special treatment, but for the right to prove that some connections are worth the risk they require. We invoke the ancient provisions not as a technicality, but as a recognition that wisdom sometimes requires us to trust in possibilities rather than hide from them. Sarah stepped back, and for a moment the chamber was completely silent. Then the High Arbiter spoke. The council will now deliberate. All parties will return to this chamber at the 13th hour for our decision. As the delegates began to file out, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and anxiety that was amplified by Lyralii's similar emotions. They had made their case as strongly as possible, but the outcome was still uncertain. Whatever happens, Lyralii communicated as they were escorted back to their quarters, we have shown them that fear does not have to be the strongest force in the galaxy. Do you think we convinced them? Sarah asked. We convinced some of them, Lyralii replied. And sometimes some is enough to change everything. When they returned to the hearing chamber hours later, Sarah noticed that the energy in the room had shifted. There was tension, but also something that felt like anticipation rather than hostility. The High Arbiter descended once again, their starlight form pulsing with unreadable emotions. After extensive deliberation, they announced, this council has reached a decision regarding the bonded pair Sarah Chun and Lyralii. Sarah felt her heart racing, and Lyralii's calm presence was the only thing that kept her from losing her composure entirely. The charges of violating Council Resolution 847 Delta are upheld, the Arbiter continued, and Sarah felt her heart sink. However, the Arbiter's voice grew stronger. The invocation of the ancient bonding provisions is deemed valid and applicable. The bonded pair has successfully demonstrated exceptional value to galactic civilization within the required time frame. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Therefore, by the authority of the original Council Charter, Section 127 Alpha, Sarah Chun and Lyralii are granted provisional legal status as a bonded entity, subject to review in one galactic year. The chamber erupted in voices, some cheering, some protesting, all expressing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Furthermore, the Arbiter continued, raising their voice above the commotion. The Council recognizes the need to re-examine our current policies regarding psychic bonding in light of the evidence presented here. A commission will be established to study the possibility of creating legal frameworks for voluntary bonding relationships. Sarah felt Lyralii's joy exploding through their bond, so intense that for a moment she couldn't tell which of them was crying tears of relief. This hearing is adjourned, the High Arbiter announced. As the delegates began to leave, many approached Sarah and Lyralii to offer congratulations or express their curiosity about the bond. Sarah noticed that several species she had never seen before were among those showing interest. Beings from the Outer Rim territories who had apparently come specifically to witness this historic hearing. Dr. Chun, came a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see Vexhai approaching, his crystalline structure blazing with happiness. We did it, Sarah said, still hardly able to believe it. You did it, Vexhai corrected. You proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing to the status quo is simple compassion. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now, said Lyralii, her mental voice warm with contentment and excitement, we show the galaxy what we can accomplish together.